should officially start. So just a couple of words from me, not to lose any time and to take any time away from your guest today. Just welcome everyone. Many thanks for joining us today. This is a special occasion because we are initiating and inaugurating today a new series of lectures and talks on the history of modern philosophy, with a special focus on the 18th century in particular. The series is actually, as you probably might know, part of a larger project that I'm directing at the University of Milan on 18th century practical ethics, and I'm lucky enough to be joined by my collaborator Michael Warshutz. This seminar, this Milan seminar, the history of modern moral philosophy, though, has a broader focus and will include talks and lectures and maybe even some book discussion, for instance, that reflect ongoing research on various aspects of modern moral philosophy, as I said, with a special focus on 18th century moral philosophy. So just please check out the schedule of the next events on our website. We already have planned the first four lectures. As I mentioned, Ryan Hanley will be one of the first four speakers. Um, Now, as of today, one can, I think, hardly think of a better way to inaugurate a series like this than with a lecture by Stephen Darwall. Professor Stephen Darwall is not only a leading moral philosopher, but also, which is not that usual, at the same time, a leading historian of moral philosophy. Without going through the list of his relevant publications on Hobbes, Kant, Smith, Hume, Grotius, Pufendorf, and I'm certainly forgetting some other writers, is written on. I'll only mention his recent volume on modern moral philosophy here, uh, which is now to be completed by a second volume on the 19th century, which should come out
I'll tell.
three.
Keep going. I'll tell you.
Oh,
That's
okay,
great.
there's some new information I didn't have.
Yeah.
So,
This
as
is
far
all
as
because of
I
Paul.
know, okay, as far as I know, so I would
Yeah.
have suspected that that's Paul's fault. Um, but it should be right that by the end of this month, a second volume is coming out with CUP on the 19th century, and maybe more, as you will tell us in a moment. So, just many thanks for accepting our invitation and be the inaugural guest of this series. We're very glad and honored to have you here. So, thanks again, and please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Stefano. So, uh, Paul Guyer is to blame for this whole thing because back in 1996 or something like that, Paul and Gary Hadfield had a series called "The Evolution of Modern Philosophy," and Paul persuaded me to do one on ethics. Um, and so I said, "Oh, okay." Uh, but now I didn't, at that point, uh, I knew nothing about post-Kantian European philosophy. Um, and so what happened was that I uh, I got a grant for a year to read. Well, I was supposed to be producing a book, but I took advantage of it to do a lot of reading uh, in Fichte and Hegel and so on. And I was reading this book by Alan Wood called Hegel's Ethical Thought, which is a great book. And it has a chapter on Fichte, and then a section of that chapter on Fichte on recognition. And I read that, and Fichte has this idea that it takes what he calls an Aufforderung, a summons from someone else to get a conception of yourself as a free being in the relevant sense, the sense that's presupposed in morality and political philosophy in the modern period. And so I thought about this idea, and I said, yeah, that sounds kind of right. And I put that together with Strawson and some stuff in Smith and so on. And so that was the second person standpoint. And so I just did this stuff. I did second personal stuff for, that, I guess the first paper came out in 2001, maybe, this paper called Because I Want It. And then in 2004, I gave a lecture, presidential address, respect and the second person standpoint, and then the book, and then there are a couple other volumes with essays. And so I was just working in the second personal field, if you like, for many years. And there was that contract that I signed. And I, of all people, would know that, well, when you sign a contract, you place yourself under an obligation. And Laura, my wife, you told me you're supposed to write this book. And are you going to do it? And I said, yeah, sure, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. But I really wasn't making much of a move to do it. And then I started to work on it. And in the years between this, the process of writing history of philosophy had changed because the internet had come along. And that's good news in many ways. I mean, there are texts that are available on the internet. You can see pretty much everything you want. And now with Anna's archive and so on. Anyway, so I did start to sit down, but the other thing was that I'd acquired different mental habits. I remain an inveterate surfer of the web, not the dark web, but the enlightened web. And I just spent a lot of time, and my attention span wasn't really apt for scholarship in history of philosophy, because you have to sit down and really concentrate on texts, and it takes a long time. So over a few years, I sort of, made myself do that. And so as Stefano was saying, the first book is out, Modern Moral Philosophy from Grotius to Kant. There are now actually 2 more volumes. The second one, Modern Moral Philosophy in the 19th Century, will come out later this month. And I finished the draft of Modern Moral Philosophy in the 20th Century, and that's now undergoing copy editing. So what I'm going to be talking about today is mainly from Modern Moral Philosophy in the from Grotius to Kant, but there's also some other stuff. So that's where we're going. So of course the title quotes Modern Moral Philosophy. That is Elizabeth Anscombe's famous essay, a kind of broadside, challenging what she called modern moral philosophy. I think Anscombe was exactly right that the characteristics of modern moral philosophy is that it has these deontic concepts of obligation and duty, and gives pride a place to blame as a central moral attitude. Now, Anscombe was no fan of this idea, though, because she thought that it presupposed something like divine voluntarism, that there could be a law that binds only if the law is promulgated and by someone in the state. Of course, it's as through the Constitution and so on. But that's not the kind of law that the moral law is. The moral law transcends that. So it had to be legislated by God. But she thought, well, most modern moral philosophers didn't really accept that. Now, of course, many did. Locke did. Pufendorf did. But as I'll be saying in a moment, I think Pufendorf's version of theological voluntarism destroys itself. It's unstable for various reasons. And you can think your way, I think, from Pufendorf to, but more about that in a moment. Okay, so Anscombe was inveighing against a law conception of ethics. That's what she was opposed to. Now, where does this come in the history of modern moral philosophy? Well, there's an old distinction that Francisco Suarez made. I gather he's not the only one who had made it, between counsel on the one hand, which we can just think of as good reasons, advice. Look, you really should do this because if you don't, you'll lose your teeth or something like that. Or, I really should learn how to walk because if I don't, I'll keep falling down. That's counsel. But that contrasts with what Suarez called law. And the distinctive feature of law is its conceptual connection to accountability, that we can be blamed rightly, fittingly, as Smith would say, properly, for violations of the moral law. Okay, so then this sort of set the challenge, Anscombe's challenge, I call it, that, well, if you're not going to be a voluntarist, maybe because you think that voluntarism destroys itself, as I'll be arguing in a moment, have some other grounding for the moral law. And I think that's a central project of modern moral philosophy, and that one of the first people to work on it, Hugo Grotius, really had the right idea, as I'll try to argue in a moment. Okay. So just to connect this a little bit to my philosophical work, take the idea of blame. So Strawson has this wonderful paper, Freedom and Resentment, in which he talks about reactive attitudes. He actually doesn't talk about blame. He talks about indignation, which is a sort of impartial, or he says impersonal version of resentment. And the idea about these reactive attitudes, philosophers these days use blame as the central case, is that they come from what Strawson called a participant stance, the stance of relating to someone in interaction with them, and that they hold the person they're blaming accountable. And there's certain presuppositions of that, and this is what I've been dining out on since 2001 or so. So if you blame someone, you have to presuppose that they can understand what you're saying, that they accept, they have available to them a working knowledge of that you're blaming them for violating. So in this case, their obligations, and that they can hold themselves accountable in their own practical reasoning for complying with the moral law. So the way I put it is that they can, well, I think the way Pufendorf puts it is they're capable of censuring themselves, that they can blame, if you like, they can feel guilt, where guilt is a Strawsonian reactive attitude. And the features of all Strawsonian deontic reactive attitudes, not the non-deontic ones like gratitude and love and so on that I've been writing about more recently, for example, in my book, The Heart and Its Attitudes, but the deontic ones implicitly make a demand of their object. And they presuppose that their object can comply with demand simply on the grounds that it's a legitimate demand. One way of saying that is to say that, well, they have a conscience in something like Butler's sense, or even the sense that Kant has in the Metaphysics of Morals. He talks about being able to erect a judge. It's really ourselves, we're judging ourselves. And the thought is that a being who doesn't have that capacity just can't be obligated. They can't intelligently be blamed for what they do. Okay. So first, I want everybody to know that Michael has kindly put the handout in the chat. So if you've come more recently, actually, you might do that again, Michael, because I don't know how it works in Microsoft Teams, because in Zoom, if you send something like that out in the chat and you come into the room later, then you don't see that. So there you go. Okay, good. So there's the handout. Thank you. So Grotius, this is Hugo Grotius, 1625, The Law of War and Peace, or Rights of War and Peace, depending on your favorite translation, accepts the Suarezian distinction between law and counsel, and he wants to provide a grounding of natural law. He calls this the fountain of right, or the fountain of law, and his answer is what he calls sociability. Now, I argue that sociability means something quite precise for Grotius. It doesn't just mean that you like hanging around other people, or it's that you have fellow feeling with them. It means that you're capable, that you're mutually accountable by virtue of having the capacity to hold yourself accountable. So I think Grotius sort of accepts a version of the idea that I've been pushing, that to be obligated, you have to have the capacity to hold yourself accountable, and there's a kind of authority that any being that has that capacity has, as Rawls puts it. I mean, of course, Grotius doesn't put it in these terms. Everyone is any being who can enter into second personal interaction of making claims and demands and of mutual accountability is a self-originating source of valid claims. Okay. So just to locate this a little bit in Grotius's text, Grotius says that he makes this distinction between perfect and imperfect rights. With imperfect rights, he calls those aptitudes, but to have a right, he says, is to have the faculty of demanding what is due. So that's in number 3 there in the handout. Okay, so this places him very much on the law side of the law-counsel distinction. And as I read Grotius, he tries to ground the law in sociability, and that's, I interpret that as the Strawson idea that to be social is to be able to enter into social relations. Those are second personal in their nature. To have intercourse, and that those come with various presuppositions. The presuppositions ground deontic morality. They ground the moral law. Okay. So let's move on to Pufendorf. So unlike Grotius, Pufendorf is a theological voluntarist. He accepts what Enscombe is saying. All of the moral law and moral obligations come from the exercise of what Pufendorf calls a moral power. A moral power is what we these days call normative powers. So normative power is something, as I analyze it, that's second personal in its nature. If I make a promise to you, for example, I'm exercising a normative power to place myself under obligation to you, but that has to be done in second personal relation. So what's a promise? A promise is where I say something to you, binding myself to you to do it, and I'm presupposing that we have this reciprocal relation of mutual accountability. In my terms, I'm giving you an individual authority to demand that I do the promised thing, and you have an individual authority to hold me personally accountable if I fail to do so. So you have a claim against me of the kind that tort law, private law, institutes. Okay, so the interesting thing for Suarez is, okay, so it's God's normative power, or he calls moral power, to command us to act. And that places us under obligation. Most interesting in Pufendorf is the psychology he thinks it's necessary for a being to have to be obligated. And also to have what he calls moral powers. So the idea is that God places us under obligation by issuing commands to us. So he has an authority over us. That can itself be grounded in God's command, a point that Cudworth famously made. God has to have authority independently of his command. And Pufendorf roughly agrees with Locke that the reason why we're obligated to God is out of gratitude for creation. He's, Paul and I were talking about the last 50 or so years of academic life. Well, let's say that all came from God. We're very happy about these lives we've lived, and thank you, God, thank you, Jesus. Okay, so there's an freestanding, if you like, obligation of gratitude that's not grounded in God's command, but by virtue of that, we're obligated to do whatever God commands us to do. Okay. Now, an important thing here is that the law of nature, or the first law of nature, I guess, for Pufendorf, is, as he calls it, the fundamental law of nature, is that we are to cultivate a sociable attitude. And that turns out to mean something very distinctive for Pufendorf. It means roughly what it meant for Grotius. In particular, this involves seeing ourselves as bound to one another with respect for a dignity that we're presupposing we both have. So in effect, Pufendorf's position is that we're fundamentally obligated to God, but by virtue of being obligated to God, we're obligated to one another. Now, I think there's actually a problem in the way Pufendorf tries to do this, because it's not clear how the latter obligation could come about through a command. But let's not worry about that. I'm happy to talk about that if we want to talk about that afterwards. So, and the other point is that God can command us only if he presupposes that we have certain capacities, the capacity to be bound by his commands. So what is this? Well, Pufendorf thinks it involves our being able to distinguish between a motive of the good, fear of sanctions. So God is all powerful. We will be punished if we violate his commands. So we have a prudential reason to do what he commands, so to avoid the sanctions. But Pufendorf says if that's the only capacity we have, if we only have what Cudworth would have called animal free will, that is, we're only capable of being moved by considerations of our own good, prudential considerations, then that's insufficient for us to be obligated. For us to be able to be obligated, we have to be able to distinguish in our own practical reasoning between the idea that we will be sanctioned, that's the fear of sanctions, but on the other hand, we have to be able to have this thought that if the sanction comes, it falls on us justly. That is, we have to be able to blame ourselves. And so we have to be capable of guilt and not just fear. Okay, now obviously, I think that's a very important idea. And I think that's a version of the idea that Grotius was having in form, but that Strawson has quite explicitly, and that what I argue for in the second person standpoint and related writings. So only sociable beings with the capacity for mutual recognition are capable of moral obligation. Okay, so that's clearly an idea of modern morality. And Pufendorf, yeah, so it was has it. And so I think in the end, his theological voluntarism is unstable. The reasons it's unstable is because God has to presuppose that we're able to blame ourselves. So there's a kind of authority that we share with God. God isn't accountable to us, but we are accountable to Him, and we're able to be accountable to Him because we're accountable to ourselves. And it's the latter accountability that we end up having to any person who's capable of holding themselves accountable. Okay. So I want to move now. I'm at number 5 now. To Locke on the concept of a person. In the essay on this concerning human understanding, Locke says that person is what he calls a forensic concept. And what he means by that is that it's a concept essentially related to accountability, to being able to be blamed, to be able to be held accountable. And again, it's the same idea. For that, you have to be capable of a law, and that's to be capable of holding yourself accountable and to blame yourself. Now, this doesn't really work unlike Pufendorf, this doesn't really work in Locke's psychology, because Locke thinks the only motives we can have are those of egoistic pleasure. And so he then deduces that we can be obligated only if there is a God who will apply the sanction. Different from Pufendorf, who says, well, the fundamental idea is that the sanction would be just and that you can judge yourself. For Locke, God is the judge, and the moral motive is fear of his eternal sanction. So it's as if, as I put it in the British moralist book, Locke has a transcendental deduction of infinite, of eternal torments, of hell, if you like, as a necessary condition for the very possibility of moral obligation. Okay, so Locke isn't a second personal thinker. Conscience for him just is the fear of sanctions, and he doesn't really make the point that I think is so crucial in Pufendorf, and I think is fundamentally correct, and that gets carried through in other writers like Butler. Okay. Now, I think it's worth pausing for a moment and to consider something else. So right now I'm teaching a course with Robert Gooding Williams on racial inequality and injustice. And the first 2 sessions were on the concept of race. And so there's what's sometimes called the modern concept of race. And we have to bear in mind that Kant was a major theorist of race. The concept of race is fashioned because of chattel slavery, and that the white ideology is that Black people aren't capable of a law. That is, they're not capable of being held accountable and holding themselves accountable, that they're not persons. They're what Charles Mills called Untermenschen, not really mention. So there's this dark truth that modern conceptions of natural rights and the modern idea of morality goes hand in hand historically with the development of the modern concept of race. Now, I don't believe for a moment that, that say, I think Marx believes this, that the modern concept of morality and rights is just an epiphenomenon that it's a bit of propaganda and ideology that comes about, for Marx because of capitalist political economic relations. So I don't think that you could theoretically have the idea of modern morality and modern natural rights and never have had the idea of race. But I think the crucial point is that once you have the idea of modern morality and rights, and you're going to enslave some people, you're going to have to, or at least extremely likely, accept an ideology according to which they can be enslaved appropriately. You violate nobody's right if you enslave them because they don't have rights in the same way that persons do. So, I think for many years, all of us were working in this area, for example, on Kant, and not really paying much attention to this stuff on race. But, circumstances have changed, and now there's a lot more attention that's paid to this. I'm not one of those who thinks, well, therefore you shouldn't read Kant. Au contraire. I agree with Lucy L.A. that you definitely should read Kant because you'll be forced to ask yourself the question, how could somebody as smart as Kant get himself into these tangles and realize that, we too are capable of these kinds of thoughts. Okay, back to the history of modern moral philosophy. Next thing I want to look at is Adam Smith on resentment, the response to being wrongly treated. So resentment is a Straussian reactive attitude. It's the central case. And it's quite interesting when you read the theory of moral sentiments. It's almost as if, I sometimes say it's almost as if Smith had read Strawson, but we don't know. I think maybe Paul knows, but whether Strawson, maybe Roger knows, whether Strawson had read Adam Smith, because they both treat resentment and gratitude in parallel style as having these distinctive characteristics. So what is resentment is conceptually tied to injustice. So it's, of course, a widely accepted conceptual truth that if you feel resentment, it's to you as if some right of yours has been violated, as if you've been unjustly treated. But Smith makes the more interesting move that what it is to be unjust is for it to be the case that someone would properly resent the treatment. That's Smith's term for what we these days call fitting resentment. Your resentment would fit, as it were, the moral reality. It would seem to you as if you've been treated unjustly, and you really were treated unjustly. Okay. And Smith also is presupposing that to have this kind of feeling, you have to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes and feel as they would feel in their situation, but you also have to be able to modulate that through an impartial perspective, not impersonal. This is a theme that keeps coming back in the history of moral philosophy. like, when you read Tom Nagel on the possibility of altruism, he's talking about the impersonal standpoint. Now, that's not just no one's particular standpoint, but it's also not a second personal standpoint. It's like what Sidgwick called the point of view of the universe. But what Smith is talking about is not that kind of point of view. He's talking about an impartial point of view, which is, as it were, among us. And so to have an impartial point of view, you have to be able to take the second person standpoint. And it's and to put yourself in other people's shoes. And then you make judgments of propriety, neither from your standpoint nor from the other person's standpoint, but from an impartial version of a second person standpoint. Okay, so for me, Smith is a very important writer. And I think he sees something that Hume doesn't see. So to see this, we should compare what Hume says. So I have this on the bottom of the second page. Were there a species of creatures intermingled with men, which, though rational, were possessed of such inferior strength, both of body and mind, that they were incapable of all resistance, and could never, upon the highest provocation, make us feel the effects of their resentment? The necessary consequence, I think, is that we should be bound by the laws of humanity to give gentle usage to these creatures, but should not, properly speaking, lie under any restraint of justice with regard to them, nor could they possess any right or property. Okay. So part of what's going on here is a difference between Smith and Hume on what they call sympathy. These days, we tend to think of sympathy as a kind of benevolence, a concern for others. But they were thinking of sympathy as something much more like what we would call empathy. Now, for Hume, sympathy turns out to just be emotional contagion. And the way emotional contagion works is that you catch somebody else's feeling, you feel a version of it yourself, but not necessarily at the thing that they're having the feeling towards. So if I catch somebody else's resentment, I'm going to feel resentful, but not necessarily towards the thing that the other person is feeling resentful for. So I think a clearest case of this is anger. You're talking to me, let's say, and you're very angry, and I catch your anger, but I don't catch it with its object, with the intentional object that you have in feeling anger. I just catch the anger, and I might as likely feel it towards you. Why are you so angry? I don't get this. Smith actually talks about this kind of case. For Smith, sympathy involves a kind of fellow feeling in the other person's shoes. So if you come in and you're angry, and you're expressing this to me, and you're telling me what you're angry at, if I put myself in your shoes, I will feel anger towards that thing as well, as if I were you. And then Smith also thinks that I will judge that proffer if I take a standpoint that's impartial between us and and then feel anger from that perspective. Okay, but the crucial difference between Smith and Hume is that Smithian sympathy, what we would call empathy, necessarily involves perspective taking, being able to put ourselves in others' shoes. And Hume really doesn't have that. And so when it comes to this, whether we would feel, this kind of case that Hume is putting before us, dealing with creatures who are not able to make us feel the effects of their resentment, then the way Smith would deal with that is, well, let me put myself in your shoes and see whether it would make sense to feel resentment from that perspective. and presumably it well might. So the difference is, I just want to note one other thing, that I think what's going on in that passage in Hume, when he says feel the effects of our resentment, he doesn't just mean that the other person is not so powerful as to be able to deliver harm to us, uh, to hit back at us, for example. He means that our sympathetic connection to them is so attenuated that we wouldn't feel by sympathy their resentment. Okay. Right. So this is just a completely fundamental difference, Smith and Hume. And I sometimes say that I think Smith is the first second personal philosopher, because he sees the role that perspective taking and has to take in judgments of justice, which are sort of the core case of modern morality. Now, one of the things I end up with in the Modern Moral Philosophy from Grotius to Kant book is the last chapter on Rousseau and Kant. There's just a little bit on Rousseau, but most of it's on Kant. And we can talk about this. I'd really like to talk about it with Paul. As I read Kant, in a certain way, he's not a modern moral philosopher. Why? Because the deontic concepts, which are, as we learned from Anscombe, the central aspects of modern moral philosophy and modern morality, for Kant, only show up in the practical reasoning of finite rational agents, beings who are subject to inclinations. Pure practical reason is the reasoning of beings who are not subject to inclination, has no use for the deontic concepts, has no use for imperatives. The basic notion in their reasoning is the good. Now, Rawls famously said, for Kant, the right is prior to the good, and there's a famous passage in the Second Critique where Kant says that. But I think what he's saying there is the right is prior to das Wohl, well-being, the good of someone. What he says about, let's see if I have this. No, I guess I don't. So what he says is the central concept in the practical reasoning of beings who lack inclinations, a holy will, pure practical reason, is das Gute, and that's the good to choose, or the choice-worthy. Okay, so the idea is that here we are, we're finite rational agents, we're subject to inclinations, and so we don't automatically do. I'll just use it. Reason talk. Kant doesn't use this talk, but I think translated, it's one that's more familiar, I think, to moral philosophers these days. Perfectly rational beings necessarily do what they have most reason to do. And the law, the practical law, is a law of their nature. It doesn't prescribe anything to them. There's no imperative. But we're not like that. We are subject to inclination. So I know that I should do A, but I have some inclination to do B. So how am I going to make myself do A? And Kant has the idea that I do this through what he calls necessitation, which is, in the end, a kind of psychological process of holding myself to account through respect. So it's the a priori feeling of respect that shows up in the phenomenal psychology of all finite rational beings like us. And so we obey the moral law out of respect. But respect is this feeling, and feeling that perfectly rational beings have. Okay, so I do have this quote. The moral law is, in other words, for the will of a perfect being, a law of holiness, but for the will of every finite rational being, a law of duty, of moral necessitation, and of the determination of his actions through respect for this law. Okay. Now, Kant's philosophy of right has, I think, a completely analogous account of rights and force, really. So necessitation is a kind of psychological force. The idea is I don't automatically do what I have most reason to do. So I have to think of reason as issuing commands to me, which I have to respect. So I think deontically only because I don't just have pure practical reason. Otherwise, I would just do what's most choice-worthy, what there's most reason to do. So I erect this idea of reason itself having a kind of authority. By authority, I don't just mean issuing normative reasons, but able to command me to do something in something like the way Pufendorf thinks of God commanding me. And so I act out of respect for that authority. And thereby, and that's what moral necessitation is. I force myself by kind of internal psychological force that comes through the feeling of respect. In the metaphysical elements of right, Kant has a completely analogous story about how I'm able to be obligated to you and you're obligated to me. So take the central case I talk about in the second person standpoint. I'm going to step on your foot, let's say. Well, you have a right that I not step on my foot. What that means for Kant is that you can legitimately force me not to step on your foot. So rights for Kant are authorized uses of force. This time it's external force, not internal force. Now, I think what this misses, again, of course, I would think this, it misses the idea that I'm trying to work up in the second person standpoint. That if I'm about to step on your foot, you can say to me, dude, you can't do that. I have a right that you not step on my foot, and I'm presupposing that you are capable of recognizing that right and of complying with my legitimate demand just because it's a legitimate demand. Yeah, okay. So let's move now to the 19th century. Modern Moral Philosophy of the 19th Century will be out at the end of this month. It has a wonderful painting by Kayabot of the floor strippers, which you may know, on the cover. So it's worth buying just for that. Anyway, so I'll just talk a little bit about Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. So these are all philosophers who they're not modern moral philosophers in the sense of they're trying to ground the modern idea of deontic morality. To the contrary. So Marx, I've just been teaching Marx in the last month, and on the Jewish question, he's perhaps clearest that deontic moral concepts of rights and justice and obligation, these are all just ideological concepts that we have by virtue of existing in political economic relations of capitalism. There is an early 20th century Soviet legal theorist named Yevgeny Pashukanis, who wrote something called a general theory of law that puts this out very clearly, that the law form, what he calls the law form, which is basically the form, the conceptual framework of modern morality and modern notions of rights, he says, requires the commodity form. And the commodity form is the form of thought under capitalism. So what are commodities? Those are things that are produced through, the commodities only have exchange value. They are produced through political economic relations, capitalist political economic relations. So Kant's no fan of modern morality or of natural rights. This then poses various challenges for him. Exploitation for him is mostly a social analytic, social scientific concept, but he writes as if it's not just that. And he can't quite say that it's unjust. So the challenge for Marxists, I think, is to work out what kind of ethical motivation makes it possible for there to be revolutionary collective action, and to not really hold people accountable in the deontic sense, but nonetheless how to deal with bad stuff in a communist social order. I'm not, I'm not myself a Marxist. I have a son who certainly is, but the challenge is, well, I think it's a challenge that people working within Occupy Wall Street, and who are part of that movement, how to come collectively to decisions that can be executed without force and without appeal to the idea of injustice, hence without Straussian reactive attitudes. And I think there are things available. There's solidarity being the most obvious one. Kierkegaard also is no friend of modern morality. He's much more friendly to it than Marx is. There are three sort of moments, ethical moments, in Kierkegaard's writings. There's the aesthetic moment. There's the moment in either or. I think what he means by ethical is what we would call deontic moral. And then there is the move in faith that suspends the ethical, so that you're moved by what I would call attitudes of the heart: faith, trust, and love. And then finally, Nietzsche argues that modern deontic moral concepts are ideological concepts. They're born of ressentiment. So that's probably a familiar story. Okay. So I want to end pretty quickly, but let me just then quickly get to my view into the 20th century. So for me, Strawson's Freedom and Resentment is hugely important. And I don't think it was really recognized. Initially, its influence was in discussions of freedom of the will and responsibility, and not as the grounding for the idea of obligation. But it's important in Strawson that one of the reactive attitudes is what he calls sense of obligation. And so the idea is that to hold somebody else accountable, you have to presuppose that they're capable of having reactive attitudes themselves, that they're capable of being moved by the sense of obligation, in something like the sense we were talking about before, when I was talking about Butler and others. So that's the idea that's central to me. And I've already said a little bit about this. So to enter into relations in which we want to make a claim on somebody else or a demand on someone else, and not to merely push them around, but to claim that it's a legitimate claim, We just have to presuppose these things that I was arguing Pudor says we have to presuppose when we enter into relations of mutual accountability. So the conceptual claim is that it's just a conceptual truth that necessarily, if an act is wrong, it's the kind of act that would be fittingly blamed were it done without excuse. As Mill puts it, we don't call something wrong unless we mean to imply that the person should be punished in some way. If not by law, then by social opinion. If not by social opinion, then through their own conscience. Again, the idea. You were just presupposing that the person has a conscience and can reason from the wrongness of something to not doing it just because it's wrong. Okay, so that's a conceptual claim. Like Strawson, I hold that blame, well, he doesn't talk about blame, he talks about indignation and resentment, that these are reactive attitudes. They imply reciprocity. They come with what I call an RSVP, and they presuppose the capacity, what I call the second personal competence, both of the addresser and the addressee. I argue they also presuppose an equal authority that both have to make claims and demands on one another. And that just is the same as Rawls's idea that we're and they are self-originating sources of valid claims. So it follows that all persons in Locke's sense, precisely Locke's sense of being capable of the law, are accountable to one another for complying with moral obligations. Now, there's still a challenge out there, which is, well, okay, I get it. If I want to play this obligation game, I have to think all those things. But what reason do I have? Things got to bottom out, let's say, normative reasons. So show me that I necessarily have conclusive reason to do what I'm obligated to do. Here, I think enlightenment comes from an unexpected place. An article by Bernard Williams called Internal Reasons in the Obscurity of Blame. And in that piece, Williams argues, I think correctly, that it's just a presupposition of blame that the person you're blaming didn't have sufficient reason to do what you're blaming them for doing. So again, this is just a conceptual point that, and here I mean the attitude of blame. I don't mean blaming someone, because you could have pragmatic reasons for blaming someone, but there can be no pragmatic reasons for blame as an attitude. That's a reason of the wrong kind for blame as an attitude. The only reasons that are the right kind are reasons that would support a culpability charge. And those are what I call second personal reasons. So if I'm just presupposing in blaming that the person that I'm blaming didn't have sufficient reason to do what you're blaming them for doing, then if my blame is warranted, as it would be necessarily if what he did was wrong, then it just follows that he couldn't have had sufficient reason for doing what was wrong. And there you have it. The circle is squared. Square the circle. Yeah. And everything comes out okay. So maybe I'll just stop on that point, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion and to your questions.